So yeah, this is the 7th metadata for machine workshop that we've scheduled out of a total of 8. So next week would conclude this series of 8 metadata for machine workshops. But I think, as I mentioned last time, this number 8 is somewhat arbitrary. So we can certainly continue this format and extend it as we like going forward. You know, I think there's still some unfinished business here, so we still have lots to talk about going forward, and I'm happy to keep facilitating this. But in any case, we're at number 7 today, and I think this will be very much a format similar to what we did last week as well. This is we will kick off with a note from Francesca, who will help us to understand more about the status of the FAIR data point installation process that's been underway. And there's been some progress and some discussion on some issues, so we'll hear about that. And then I'm happy to take over on the leading trail of that to discuss a little bit more detail about this verification process that we will turn our attention to once the FAIR data points are up and running. And I want to conclude with some options that we have as a group at the end for what this verification process might look like. But it's going to require a little bit of fact-finding here. We have to answer some questions about privacy issues. So we have options, but we also need to understand those options. So I'll raise those issues later on at the end. And I'm ready to go whenever you are, Charles. Just give me a signal.
By all means, go ahead.
Yeah.
Just a small reminder to all the participants, let's keep our mics muted so we do not disrupt the presentation from all the background noises. So take some time to switch off your mics, as well as if you do have any questions during the presentation, just drop them in the chat box and we can highlight them as the presentation goes on. So yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Charles. So as I just mentioned, basically 2 topics today. One is a continuation from last week on the FAIR data point technical troubleshooting, and we'll hear from Francesca in just a moment. And then the second thing, as I mentioned, is we dive a little bit deeper into what the patient records verification might look like and some options that we have for us there. So I will give the microphone over to Francesca.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome everyone. I would also like to especially welcome Zura from Tunisia, who is joining us for the first time. She just joined the Tunisia team sometimes last week, and she's attending our webinars for the first time. Zura Toti, you're welcome. I'm going to spend like 2 minutes to talk about the status, really just to give you a recap, because I've been in talks with the country coordinators and the TOT support for each country. And I think it's ideal that for today, they should be the one to talk about the situation with their FDP deployment. I don't want to be like in process, it's deployed. Let each person explicitly talk about their own country status. Last time we had one in production deployment in Uganda and the second one in progress. For Ethiopia, we had one in production deployment and the second in progress. And then same for Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and then for Tunisia, we also had the one for Tunisia in production deployment. So today, if you go to the next slide, Eric, we're going to be hearing from each of the country coordinators. We spend 2 minutes. Please let us keep to time for each of the country coordinators to actually give us the updates on their FAIR data points for their country. So we start with Uganda. Miriam Basaja, you have 2 FDPs for Uganda, one for KIU and the other for Case Hospital in Kampala. So we'd like you to spend like 2 minutes or less to give us an update on the situation in Uganda. Miriam, please.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So in regards to the FTPs in Uganda, I already deployed the one at KIU, and it's running very well now. And then the one for CEST clinic, for the CEST hospital, I'm working with Norbert on getting it to the running stage as well. It's currently on the production deployment stage, and soon it will be running as well.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. For the KIU, I'm looking at it. I don't want to share my screen, but I just want to say, do you mind editing the text in the FDP homepage to at least give a brief description of your FDP, the country FDP, instead of the default?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll do that.
Yeah, so please just do that. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So for Ethiopia, Mekele University, Dr. Give brief updates.
Hello, can you hear me? This is Gaitu.
Okay.
So in our case, from the beginning, we were trying to have a subdomain from our university. And when we requested it, they were not, they said it's not allowed to provide SSH access privilege. Then I managed to have access to another server for other research from our center, Digital Health Research and Development Center. However, the server has only public IP address. It has no domain name. I was able to install the FDP, but I have got 404 error. If you can see the home call, the address 197.156.104.225 was our address, our server's address, but still it is giving me error, 404 error. Going forward, we are not going to use this server because it has no domain name. So what we are planning is to buy some sort of virtual private server from Amazon or somewhere else, and we are going to have subdomain name from the university, and then we will map the domain name to the virtual private server. Then I hope it will work soon. So our update is so far it looks like this. I think in Addis Ababa case they are trying to get the server access privilege. So more or less we are in the same page with the Addis Ababa University as well. So what I want to request is, what if we have a virtual private server from Amazon or somewhere else, and we use the subdomain from our university, and we can map it so that we can run the FTP. Thank you.
Thank you. I think let's hear from the others first, then I'm going to throw it back to Eric and Gofe actually. Dr. Wondimu, if you'd like to say something about the situation in Addis Ababa University, the FTP. Is Dr. Wondimu in yet?
Maybe Tegist can talk about Addis Ababa University. I can see Tegist.
Okay.
I see Wondimu on WhatsApp has, I think, network problems.
As Gate said, we are also on the same page. We are trying to get the subdomain, and we're discussing with the university system admins.
Okay. All right, thank you, Tegist. For Nigeria, Dr. Sakinat.
Yes, good afternoon. We are actually, I have deployed locally, but now deploying to FDP GoFair server, we have problems synchronizing the subdomain that we purchased with the server. We spent the whole of the weekend doing that, but hopefully with Namopi that's actually helping us, I think we should call home anytime soon. I can't give an accurate time because of those kind of problems that we observe along the line, but we hope to call home soon. Then for the Olabisi Onabanjo University, we want to be through with the first FDP home calling before we start with that. So that's the report I have on our FDP creation.
Okay, so for Nigeria, you already purchased a domain.
Yes, we purchased the domain, a subdomain for the FDP. So we are trying, the problem we have for the past 1 week now is synchronizing between the subdomain that we purchased with the FDP server. So as soon as we are done with that, I think that is calling home.
Okay, I guess we'll have to talk with Nambobi to also know the kind of error message so that we'll look at everybody's situation and see a common solution that will work for everyone. I know Eric had suggested something in the email when I was in an exchange with him on this issue of domain naming and all that. So probably we'll look into that and see what works for everyone. If we're able to have an idea of the error message, someone might be able to make a suggestion and help. Thank you, Dr. Sakinat. Dr. Reginald, would you like to speak about the situation in Kenya?
Yes, good afternoon. Just a brief report that last week we were able to reach at the level of the fair data point with Eric. I think we managed to at least work on the email, but where we are right now is that we need permission from the Nairobi City County MOH for the use of the server and synchronize the data at Westlands Sub-County and Kamkunji. So that's where we are and we are discussing. Also, the other note is that there's been a reshuffle within the Nairobi City County Medical Fraternity. So we need to know who are the new directors, that I can meet them this week and then get the permission to work towards the installation. And maybe we can call home before the end of the week. Thank you.
Okay, Tunisia, Professor Miriam.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. In the beginning, I'd like to thank all members of ODAN team for their efforts, and especially Professor Miriam, Professor Francesca, and Sir Namombi for their precious help. Concerning our Tunisian case, we succeeded in the execution of the FDP call home. For this point, I have to precise that we use the Mac OS as an operating system. Now, for the production deployment, we asked for the hosting of the Tunisian for the FDP in the University of Sousse server. This permission have to be obtained from the CCK, which is the Tunisian Internet Service Provider for the Ministry of Higher Education. Our request is in progress. They promised us to do their best to have it as soon as possible, and we are waiting now for the requested subdomain. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miriam, and thanks to everyone for the update. So apart from Nigeria that seems to be having some technical problems with the synchronization, there is also the issue of the virtual private server network, which may seem to work. If Northern Africa is willing to at least pay for VPS for those countries, I'm hoping that we'll be able to get at least a subdomain to map into those VPS from the universities. The essence of wanting it to be on the university, domain is just to show ownership, or the hospital or the city council, just to indicate ownership But if that doesn't work, we'll probably start looking into the option of getting a Vodafone Africa PPS for everyone, and then have the countries deploy on those for the affected countries. But I personally would have loved for the universities and university hospitals to take ownership, especially even the indicating the ownership even in the access path for the FDPs. So I'm going to be handing over to Eric, because the technical thing is actually a Go Fair part, and hopefully he's going to help us as well to figure out a way out of this point where we are. Thank you. Eric, it's over to you.
Great, thank you, Francesca, and thank you everybody for your updates. So I think it's quite nice to see everybody making the progress, and it looks like we confront similar issues in each case. So I think that's quite hopeful, because it means we can probably share solutions as well. So this is something to be continued over the next week. And I will work first with Francesca on this, but then we can address the individual problems as needed. And we can also bring Luis and Case back into the loop with specific questions. But speaking of Luis and Case, I am able to link you to a YouTube video today as of about an hour ago. So this just finished about 2 weeks of work from Luis. He created about a 5-minute introductory video to install the FAIR data point locally on your computer. And Case thinks that with, before this webinar is over, he will actually have a video for the production deployment servers as well. So I think this was originally conceived as one video introduction, but it got a little bit too long, so they split it into 2 pieces. And here's the first installment, but we will make sure that the link to the second one is available as well. So it's kind of fun just to see that these things are coming up in real time here. And what's nice is that the video, I think, very much can incorporate some of the blocks and the issues that were confronted in the last few weeks here. And also then it makes this already the beginning of our documentation deliverables in this project. These are the kind of things that we're going to need at the end of the project to see that the FAIR data point can be deployed more and more locally by people who can get up to speed on everything that's needed to actually show a FAIR data point deployment. So if you have comments or suggestions on this video, let me know. I will pass them on to Luis or pass them directly on to him if you like. But then that would be a great way to probably get to a version 2 on this, before the project is over, so that we really have a very nice presentation that can help people get started pretty quickly. So are there any other questions or comments at this point? Because what I will do in the next few slides then is reintroduce this idea of verifying data within the hospitals. So are there any questions or comments right now on the status of the FAIR data points? Okay. All right, then I will move on. And some of these slides are pretty basic introduction to this idea of linked data and semantic web. We might have talked about some of this before in previous metadata for machine workshops, but what I would like to do is kind of start from the beginning again and really build up our understanding, because there will be some technical issues at the end that I want to present, and I think this will give us a good foundation for that. I consider myself very much a non-technical person. I'm a biologist by training. That's my expertise. So even though maybe some of these slides will look to some of you as being a little bit over technical, they're in fact designed really for people like me. These slides were designed in part to help me understand how to do these things. These are slides that are very much intended for, in fact, the data stewards who may be embedded in the local hospitals, who will be actually having your hands on patient records, and who will be responsible for stewarding that patient information into the electronic case report forms. That's really our target in this project. So I hope anyways that this information can bring non-technical people to feel a little bit more comfortable about what all this linked data stuff is about. And what I say here, by the way, is equally applicable to metadata, that in the world of fair data, both data and metadata can be rendered machine actionable. So that's perfectly true in both cases. Yes, so this is a familiar way of looking at some typical data. This is my own spreadsheet. I'm studying here peptide molecules, and it's a spreadsheet of many peptides, each row, and the columns are different things that I know about those peptides. And if I start really from the beginning and say, well, what is data? I want to think of this as really like controlled and standardized, normalized information, so that I can begin to see patterns in this data. And already in my spreadsheet, you can begin to see some patterns, and we can interpret those because we know everything's been standardized. And I want to emphasize that this is very much a human readable presentation of the data. This is really designed for people and for humans that are very visual oriented. But all of this data could just as well be encoded such that the computer could actually track it in a way that a human can. So for every row and column, we can give a name and help, kind of define that so the computer can understand what it's looking at. And then in any particular case, if I have, for example, column H in row 25, I'm looking at a value of 0.2 there. If all the rows and columns were marked up and all the concepts were defined so that the computer could identify them, then the computer could actually interpret what this value of 0.2 means at that position of H25. So there would be a way you could imagine of creating a code that would just enumerate every row and column and every position in a way that the computer could basically understand that data point. It's sort of like annotating all those data points. And there's actually a way to do that, but I'm going to show you now a slightly different view of it. Given that I have a bunch of data, I will say then that I will define that knowledge and knowledge representation is really identifying these associations that are implied by data. And what do I mean by this? In this case, I have a simple sentence: malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. This is actually this is actually coming from Baron Mons, my boss, who's worked in Africa on malaria for I think 15 years. And so he studied malaria very intensely before we moved into the fair data world. And this was an example that he typically gave even before Vote on Africa, but it's still a very handy example for us. This is a statement. It is an assertion about the world around us. We're saying that a disease has some kind of cause from some kind of animal or organism, insect. And it's really this unitary element of thought. It's an assertion about the world. And if you remember back to your grade school days, your teacher might have talked about the way we can diagram a sentence as being somehow a subject, predicate, and object. And this is really the unitary way of describing an association between two things. So we have a subject, in this case malaria, has a relationship, in this case infectious disease transmission by an insect vector, and another concept, the object, in this case mosquitoes. And a technical term here is, we call this a semantic triple. And it's really this, it's seen as this unitary element of knowledge or thought. And computer scientists have figured out ways to encode triples, which is a way of sort of encoding these elemental units of thought. And I'm giving a link here to the semantic web and semantic triples. To the degree that malaria and insect or disease transmission by insects and the insect itself, to the degree that these things can be identified and defined in a precise way, and maybe even given unique identifiers or codes so that the computer can understand them better than just free text, then we begin to build up sort of the established knowledge of the world. And these are, we can capture that in what we call ontologies or vocabularies. And again, I give a link to what we mean by ontologies here in a more technical sense. But each of these codes here are representing these concepts in some kind of well-defined dictionary or ontology that's online. And if I take these identifiers and embed them in internet URLs, then I can actually link to these things on the internet. And in fact, if I string these URLs together, then I have a way of linking these concepts together in the way that a machine can understand, and in a way that makes the entire internet kind of like one big database. And there's a language for doing this. It's called RDF, and I give another link to that here. And RDF is just it's a language. It's a grammar that helps you to kind of, in a more expedient, efficient way, to create these triples, and allows a machine to kind of track the way you've arranged the triples and what you want to say with them. And so RDF is a computer language like any other that any of us could learn if we had the time or interest. Just to show you what these identifiers on this page are linking to, if I click on that link, I will get to an ontology called, that's about rare diseases, and it's called Orphanet, and there's malaria, this particular disease, and all kinds of information about it. And in some cases, when we link to these concepts, you might get a page of HTML, or just kind of an ordinary web page, which might be designed for humans, and then humans can read and learn. But if this information itself were linkable, were made in RDF, then the computer could actually link to these ontologies and learn a whole lot about malaria, just because everything that we want to say about it could be machine readable on this page. So humans can read this, but maybe also machines as well. Here's here's the predicate that we saw before, disease transmission for infectious diseases. And this is coming from another ontology called BioPortal, or the medical subject headings from the US government. And these, well, and anyways, here's the page that talks about this idea of infectious diseases. And there's a definition here, there's some synonyms, and other information. And then lastly, the object of that sentence was the mosquito. And in this case, it's a particular species of mosquito. And again, there's a kind of a page where you can learn about it but maybe also there's information here for the computer to link to as well. There's lots of ontologies out there. In fact, we may, even before this project is over, we may be consulting something called Wikidata. And Wikidata is really like Wikipedia, but everything is made as linked data and is made available for the machine. It's not just free text for humans, but it's really, everything is very much built on triples, so the computer can understand what it is we're saying about different topics. And I think there's, in Wikidata, you can already see the knowledge base with 87 million data items, and anyone can edit that. So if we need, for example, country codes, we might go to Wikidata for that. There's another ontology called Ontopy, and again, it's pretty extensive and can be useful for us. I'll give a third example, and that's referring back again to BioPortal. I think there's 700 biomedical ontologies here, but a very handy resource. In fact, nowadays, an essential resource for building up machine actionable references in health and medicine and biology. Just a quick example then to make it a little bit more concrete. I want to show you an example that we have from our own lab here when I was at the Leiden University Medical Center. And this is kind of showing how this connected data can work in practice. So there were two very large data repositories out there. One was called Phantom 5. This is a functional annotation of mammalian genomes. So it's a huge project, a large number of stakeholders, and the task was very ambitious, and that was to map all of the regulatory sequences in the mammalian genome. But to do that, we also investigated, I think, mouse and rat genomes, et cetera. So lots of data, but very important, essential, foundational knowledge. And then there's also the Leiden Open Variation Database. And this is a very nice federated system of databases that allows practicing doctors and physicians to make annotations on the mutations they observe in their patients. And if they think a mutation is related to a disease, they can say that. If they say there's a mutation and they don't know what its impact is, they can say that. So it's a very high quality curated database of gene disease relationships, or let's say mutation disease relationships. And what we did is we went into these two data sets and we modeled part of them using these triple notations and these ontologies. So for example, in the Phantom 5 case, we have the basic element is this Phantom 5 annotation. And it's basically saying that for a particular part of the genome on a location of a particular chromosome, in this case, chromosome 2, I think that's the 19th version of the human genome, reference genome, that the Phantom 5 annotation is on a position between this part of the genome and that part of the genome. So the start and the end part of this annotation on the genome. That annotation is for a transcription start site, and it's for a particular gene, gene number 8291. And you can see the predicates are marking up in between all of these concepts. So it's really a subject predicate object relation in each case. But all those predicates and subjects and objects are linking back to a defined ontology, in this case, a reference sequence ontology or sequence ontology, et cetera. We did the same thing for the LOVD. In this case, we had an LOVD annotation. It was on a region with a start site and an end site. It was also on chromosome 2 of this same reference genome. The annotation in this case is a deletion, and we call it a LOVD variant. And what we were able to do then with this marked up data with these triples was to ask a question using another language called Sparkle, but we were able to ask a question about all the transcriptional start sites that might be related to a disease-causing mutation. And the answer that we got was that 20% of all the known disease-causing variants are mapping to a transcriptional start site, are mapping to a regulatory element and not to the gene itself, per se. So what's nice about this is that we could answer this question, but we could answer many, many other questions without ever having to touch this data format ever again. It's very flexible now. For example, we can link to the gene in the Phantom 5 case is 8291. There's all kinds of things we know about that gene, and we can link out to that as well. And so we can build up bigger and bigger knowledge graphs that the machine can navigate to begin to answer more and more complicated questions for us and find more and more complicated associations. And so this was just a simple example using these two data sets. But if we come back into Vaudhan, Africa, into this project again, let's think about the WHO case report form. And I have a link to it down here at the bottom of the page. But you can see that it's really just kind of this general intake form. It's capturing all kinds of biomedical information at the bottom, all kinds of administrative information at the top. And at the moment, this was a PDF. So it's just a document you could print physically and check the boxes if you'd like. And you may recall at the beginning of this Vaudhan project, the team here in Leiden took this form in using ontologies and this triple notation and building identifiers. We were able to render this form in a machine actionable RDF format. So it's a very complicated code here. It looks horrible for the human, but it looks great for the machine. The computer can understand this much more than it can understand this PDF document. So there's a lot of, we would say, semantics built into this WHO form. And then here's the familiar picture we come back to. We have a fair data point for a particular hospital. It hosts the metadata for each and every case report form that's created in the context of that hospital. And what we will be concerning ourselves with in the not too distant future will be the verification of this patient data into this case report form. And so again, yeah, just reminding us that the WHO PDF was rendered into this electronic format for us. I'm going to blow up the picture a little bit so we can see more closely what this verification process is going to look like. So again, we have a hospital. There's some kind of record keeping process in place right now. This is probably unique to each and every hospital or clinical environment. But then we will have a Vaudhan Africa data steward who can interdict the information flow in this record keeping process and help to extract the relevant information into the electronic CRF. And that's kind of one way of viewing this process. We might think about it in a very clumsy way. We might say, well, okay, this data steward, maybe if they're comfortable enough with RDF as a language, they could manually encode the patient record information, the appropriate information into the RDF of the case report form. But that's tedious and difficult, even for experts. But what's nice about this RDF format is that if you remember back at the beginning here, I showed a picture of one of my spreadsheets of my own data that I have. That spreadsheet is a human readable version of data. It's designed for humans. But I mentioned we could just as well encode that for the machine. Well, here's a case where the information is encoded for the machine, but we could project it back into a format that's convenient for humans, whether it's a spreadsheet or something else. And it turns out there are some very nice tools out there that allow you to project that RDF back into a format that's easy for humans to see. And this is what I'm showing you here. I'm going to blow this up a little bit. This is a form that's very human readable, and it's asking the same questions as in the WHO case report form. And it's asking you to tick boxes, to supply information. There's icons here that are helping you along the way, so you know what kinds of things you should be entering in each case. But because this form is a CDAR enabled form, it will be able to capture your answers and create an RDF file at the other end. So it's capturing the patient record information in this semantic model of the RDF. And so that's highly convenient because we can just look at a web interface, see a very familiar form, but actually create RDF in the process. And so I mentioned this last week. This is a CDAR form. There's a nice tooling associated with this. And over the last week, we've had discussions with the group in Stanford University that runs and builds CDAR. And we started to explore possibilities that they might be willing and able to use the existing form that I just showed you. So this thing really exists right now already. That maybe our data stewards in Vote on Africa would be able to use this in a very efficient way to capture the patient record data. There's one issue here. Well, let me say that the training to use CDAR would be pretty minimal. It's, I think in a webinar, you would basically be able to learn how to log in to CDAR, create an account, and pull up the CRF form, and either having records that were previously collected at your side, or whether you were sitting face to face with the patient, you would be able to create these forms. The only complication here is that the CDAR form at the moment, or let's say the CDAR infrastructure at the moment, is based at Stanford University in California. What this would mean is that the data would have to travel outside Africa to California to be rendered as the RDF and then brought back to Africa for storage and for serving. And I think technically, this is not a problem. This could happen, I think, pretty much immediately without any sophisticated development. This is really out of the box application here. And I think even the information could be turned around in milliseconds. So it's not even that the information would be stored at Stanford. It could really be encrypted, brought to California, converted to RDF, and then imported back to the servers in Africa. However, there's a moment where that data is traveling and is being transported. And I think there's a question now in the group. I think Miriam launched a discussion with some of the medical experts in Vote on Africa about what this might look like from the point of view of Vote on Africa and some of the legal and ethical issues about transporting patient data this way. So that's a discussion that's in progress, and we will, I'm sure, make progress on it in the next week. But when this is resolved, if it should be resolved in the positive, that I think this can be implemented pretty much immediately. So we could have a video, or sorry, we could have a webinar, for example, with the guys from CDAR, who would immediately be willing to lead a short training on this. We could practice a little bit and then see if we can begin to create the actual case report forms. There's another solution out here, and I also mentioned this last week. There's another solution, but this is still probably 6 weeks away from us at the moment. It's in development right now, and so we don't have it immediately ready to use. But this will be from an organization called the Data Stewardship Wizard that could build essentially something like an RDF form, like very much like a CEDAR form, but it would be embedded in the FAIR data point itself. So this would mean essentially downloading and installing an upgraded version of the FAIR data point. But then you would have a form built in that would allow data stewards to start capturing and keeping the data entirely locally on site in Africa. So that's another solution that's coming. But we started to explore the CEDAR case just in case we needed to, or we had an opportunity to do this sooner rather than later. We wanted to have another option here. And in any case, in keeping with the Go Fair rules of engagement, we want to prevent vendor lock-in wherever possible. So we really like to keep it open to developers to come in and develop solutions here. And that's all I want to say today. This is just kind of a status update on where we are with this potential verification process. I think we're diving pretty deeply into the critical issues right now. And hopefully we have resolution on some of the high level issues. We invite everyone who wants to comment on this, you know, and anyone who has insight to please contribute to the discussion. That's why it's nice to bring it up in the webinar today. But hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we can figure out exactly what would be the best way, most efficient way to help data stewards start capturing the data on site. And so I'll leave it there for today. Maybe we have a few minutes for questions, and I turn it back over to Charles.
All right. I think today's session was uniquely informative. So if we do have any questions or comments, now is your time to express ourselves. So you can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute your mic and ask your question directly, and you will get a response. I can see in the chat box, Sakinat was highlighting that Vodan actually owning a central domain or VPS that they can now list out to the country projects is actually a good idea that is worth pursuit. Which as well, I think would be great. Make it easier for everyone to deploy, to have a central place to access.
Charles, may I just ask a follow-up on that?
Yep.
Would the idea be that maybe for example, just as a what if, if the Vote on Africa Foundation,
Yep.
for example, were to have a kind of registry or directory of the Vote on Africa FAIR data points? Is that what the question was getting at?
I think, yeah, based on what I'm seeing from Sakinat's comment, it's more of a virtual private server.
Okay,
In
yeah.
case individuals are having issues with accessing domains from their institutions or the like, it would be
Got it, yeah.
more practical to have the various country projects having their FDPs under one domain, more or less, and then everyone would have their own subdomain representing each country.
Got it, yeah.
Yeah. Unless Sakinat would like to add.
Thank you, Charles. You actually got my points, because we have been having problems synchronizing these VPS and this subdomain problem. So I think having a central one will actually erase the problem, and each country can have a subdomain on the central Vodan Africa.
Yeah.
I don't know. Now I have an issue with that. I don't know if there are systems people or web people here to also offer some guidance. I'm not really much of a web engineering person, but if you remember, the issue of governance and decentralization is one of the key pillars of the FAIR principle. So by the time you start talking about a central domain and central point, I hope it doesn't take away the message of fairness, whereby data resides where they are collected here. So we have to also consider the issue of having a central place vis-a-vis the FAIR principle of decentralization. I don't know, Eric, you're from Go Fair, so you might, and then maybe Professor Miriam too, if she's available, or Beth might be able to help us to shed more light on that. Having a central web domain, or sorry, a central server for Vodafone Africa, will that not negate the principle or go against the principle of FAIR that says, okay, data resides where they are and all that?
So yeah, I'm really glad you bring it up for clarity, Francesca. This was the reason why I asked my question, which was, you know, it's very much in keeping with this principle of when we think about fair data, that we think about it, we tend to think about it as allowing, for good purposes, the interlinking of distributed data platforms wherever they may be. And so even in the case of a fair data point, you know, one fair data point may be linking to many different hospitals in principle.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Or let's say many different data sets within a hospital. And so what I can imagine is that for example, the Vote on Africa Foundation may choose to run a fair data point whose job is only to reference the other Vote on fair data points. And that would be one way of creating, or let's say simulating almost a kind of portal, a centralized portal, but without any centralization going on whatsoever. It's still a very distributed network of fair data points, each one independently operating, and of course encoding all of its governance and regulations locally. But we could still get a kind of a global picture of that by way of running a fair data point at a central location. And I would then also agree with your caution. What we don't want to do is say, well, for the sake of ease and efficiency, we just want to maybe centralize all of our data resources in one place and create a centralized data repository. I think that would undermine some of the benefits that we can accrue from the verification of the data. So yeah, it's a funny combination of being centralized, but also being decentralized for the sake of making sure that the data really has localized governance behind it.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. I hope Dr. Reginald from Kenya is listening, because I know we're going to have that we may have that problem with some of the countries. I know Kenya already, they have an issue of having someone from another country help them with their production deployment. What if he steals our data and all that? So that's why I want us to be a little careful with the central PPS thing, and to make sure that everyone is on the same page and we're able to convince them that it doesn't now mean a central data repository. Your data still remains yours and under your governance, and this is just for operational efficiency purposes, hopefully. Okay, I actually is typing a message. I didn't know he was going to do that. I was just talking because I didn't talk to him, and I know Kenya. Okay, he has just.
Yeah, nice to have it.
Yeah. So everything will still have to go back to Go Fair, Eric, because the Go Fair is the architect of at least that we know, of the FAIR principles. So you're going to have to think of an optimal and acceptable deployment paradigm for everyone. We're going to have to still throw it back to you.
Okay, well, you know, and let's say that's a question that should get resolved, right, in the next immediate future here, the next week, say, if we can swing it. And what I can say as well is that the decision that's made here will likely carry over to the Netherlands, where I'm involved right now in setting up the projects for COVID-related research in the Netherlands. And the intention is the same, is to set up fair data points at local hospitals throughout the Netherlands. And so, you know, I think the solution derived here could very well, very likely inform how it's done as well in the Netherlands. So an excellent topic to I will try to steward that through the technical people in the next week.
Okay, thank you.
In Francesca, we can really let's collaborate on that as well. I will fold you into, if I send out any queries to technical people I know here, I'll be sure to include you on that.
Oh yeah, sure.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have any more questions or comments?
I think there is one from Gusite.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, he's highlighting we need strong SSL for the data traffic to and from the Stanford University for the RDF rendering.
Yeah. Yeah, and as I understand, the SSL will be there in any case. It might be just an issue of, you know, under certain rules and regulations, you know, that encrypted data will be out there. I don't think anyone will be able to see it or decrypt it. But then we still have a question, you know, what if it is intercepted? I think highly unlikely, but it's just to really think through the possibilities. If that data should be intercepted, should be copied out anywhere, what does that mean?
Yep.
And in what's how does Vote on Africa feel about, or you know, what's the rules and regulations that we want to abide by in terms of making those decisions?
Professor Miriam is an avid supporter for Reginald's opinion in terms of keeping the data as local as possible for the purposes of accountability. Yeah.
In Charles, just I can make a comment here. I think everyone sees it on the screen, but as promised, just before the end of the webinar here, Case has supplied a link to the Fair Data Point production deployment demonstration, and that's at this YouTube link, which is also in the notes here, and I'm sure we can make that available.
Yeah, the link to the production deployment demo by Case, the link is in the chat box. So if you need to watch it or visit it, you will find it there, as well as in the troubleshooting group in the Slack channel. I believe it is there as well. All right, then I guess it's a wrap for today. We'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us here today. Some final announcements: the recorded version of this webinar will be available on the Vodafone Africa website next week. So in case you missed some part of it, just check in the course of the week, latest next week, and you will be able to revisit it. Also, be sure to join us next week or next Tuesday for the 8th installment of the Metadata for Machines workshop. Details on how to log in and how to join will be shared on the various Vodafone Africa and communication channels on Slack and on WhatsApp, or the various WhatsApp groups. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I guess we will see you next time. Francisca and Eric, thank you for great job
Eric.
done.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.